Next up, really happy to introduce Zina Manji, who's going to be a regular on the Digital Health Symposia on a monthly basis. And today, she's going to be talking about digital health and neuroscience with Aman Bhatti. And so, Zina, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yes, my name is Zina Manji. I'm Director of Regulatory Affairs for Innovation at Haleon. And my career focus is on advancing regulatory strategy for digital and med tech innovations, really the convergence of technology towards improving health outcomes and towards value-based care. So I'm really excited, and thank you to Stan and the HITLAB team for this inaugural session here today. And on the launch pad here with me today is Dr. Aman Bhatti, CEO of Cumulus. And we're going to focus on specific aspects of digital health and neuroscience. So Aman, a few words about yourself and Cumulus.
Sure. Thank you, Zina, for having me. Good to see you again. So again, Aman Bhatti, CEO of Cumulus, just joined. I think this is week 6 now. I'll get to a point where I stop counting. But we're really excited about what we're doing here at Cumulus. At Cumulus, we're developing digital biomarkers for the brain, really to do 2 things. One is to accelerate CNS drug development, as well as then enabling physicians to diagnose, treat, and manage patients with various CNS conditions with precision wherever they are. Whether they're at home or other remote destinations. So we're really excited about the topics here at hand and what we're doing to help solve the gaps in care around CNS disease pathology.
Excellent, Aman. Thank you. And that really speaks to how, as we see science and technology evolve, that it's really enabling a deeper, a more precise understanding of disease and health outcomes, especially experienced on a patient by patient basis, and how that influences treatment or towards advancement of treatment. So you spoke about diagnosis, and so what do you see in this area and the key unmet need that you're looking at in CNS disorders such as dementia and Alzheimer's?
Yeah, there's really 2 unmet needs if you look at the spectrum of the healthcare industry. On the early development side, really on the drug development side, is the ability to do at-home or frequent measurements in patients while they're at home, and really increasing access to care in clinical trials. Specifically, we know that there's only a certain subset of countries that may have PET scans or ability to do blood biomarkers, and for us, really the challenge in CNS drug development seems to be that finding those patients, being able to find them where they are, and allowing them to partake in clinical trials, as well as then quantifying during a clinical study on a frequent basis how various dimensions of brain function are doing. So, right now, the traditional methods being every 3 or 6 months, you may do measurements, at home, in clinic using paper-based assessments. Can we use digital technologies to get more frequent measurements on patients to enrich the data that's being captured in clinical trials? And on the healthcare side, so once obviously that's drug development, but on the healthcare side, in the last mile delivery to patients, it's really about, can we earlier diagnose patients? And earlier diagnosis has various impacts here. That allows the patient themselves to be part of their treatment decisions, so they're not just being treated at the whim of their caregiver and the physician. They're involved in care, and also it opens up options for them to look into various different ways to either go under some behavioral modifications that allow them to potentially reverse some causes of things like dementia, or look into alternatives like clinical trials and other opportunities to treat their condition.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I've had some experience witnessing early onset of dementia and Alzheimer's, and from that kind of caregiver patient perspective, the signs were there early on, but that's kind of looking at it retrospectively, and it's really hard to define what's actually happening. Is it just aging, or is it something kind of more serious? And the traditional methods you talk about, at least in the early stage when you go for treatment, you're kind of left unsatisfied with knowing, well, like from the paper-based assessments you talked about, it's a point in time, and you go back home, you don't know, was it just that point in time? Is there something more serious? Is it progressing? Is it improving, or is it getting worse? And what do you do about this? And that quality of life aspects there. Because when you get the diagnosis, it feels very sudden, but actually it had been progressing for a while.
Right.
So from my perspective, it's that access to knowledge that really drives that better human understanding of really what's happening in the brain, and how to help patients as well. So what do you think needs to shift in the healthcare system so that these conditions are recognized and treated more efficiently and earlier?
Yeah, I think, generally speaking, I think what you describe is right on with what we hear from patients. And, it's that concept of, are you guiding me on a bad day, or are you getting me, and I haven't had my caffeine, I didn't sleep well, et cetera. Right. So I think what needs to shift is the openness of the healthcare system in looking at frequent measurements. Right. I think that's what's happening with digital transformation overall is, the digital health industry and community is increasing the abilities of physicians to capture data from patients over a course of time, rather than kind of like a single time point. Perhaps even, again, as we said, at best, if you're being assessed every 3 months, you're only being captured every 3 months, and you never know what dealing with parking, taking time off, being rushed to go ahead and pick up a child from work, or trying to get back to work, right? So I think that as it stands, the entire healthcare industry has to shift to allowing for the utilization of tools, digital tools that allow for physicians to get that picture of what's happening over time, and then you kind of start to look at the averages versus, again, the single time point snapshots.
Yeah, and so some of what you're talking about is really that those barriers to innovation, which a key aspect is adoption.
Right.
And so when I look at kind of technologies, a key aspect is that intended use, building the value from claims and evidence generation, being really clear about what the intended use is, so that you can kind of define the user and what's meaningful to the user towards those health outcomes, and kind of adapting, being open to adapting that as your innovation develops and evolves and you go through your milestones. So can you talk further about, about the aspect of adoption in this therapeutic area, and using that digital tool as a modality of diagnosis, and how healthcare professionals are critical as an access point for that adoption, and how that influences, your development strategy?
Yeah, we have to build with the user, right? We have to build with the end user. And I think that's something that's critical. As we've done, Zina, you and I have worked in the same companies and been fortunate enough to work side by side. We start with the customer and get insights from, so in this case, if it's clinicians are going to be utilizing our product, we want to get early insights on what are the gaps that exist, and how can our solution go ahead and fill those gaps, yet be used in a manner that kind of interstitches with their current workflows, right? And I don't mean workflows by EHR integration. Everybody kind of goes down that route, and we all know there's 600 plus EHRs out there, and that's just the final step, or a step, I should say, towards the end of integration. But really, you want to build with the customers. I mean, here at Cumulus, Cumulus was actually the culmination of the experts in the biopharma industry saying, in CNS drug development, saying, the gaps that we have existing today is that we don't have an ability to get frequent, clinically meaningful, clinically validated data from patients that have various CNS disorders, when being able to do that in a manner that allows them to do it at home, when they're in an environment that they're not under stress, and also that allows us to increase the diversity that we see in trials, because again, having people to go all the way out from rural areas to clinical centers. And I guess that's why we've seen the success we've seen so far at Cumulus in the supporting the biopharma industry and decentralized trials and all. But as we look and shift to healthcare, again, sitting down with our end users, whether it's general practice physicians, whether it's neurologists, whether it's psychiatrists, and then what's key there is getting the insights that give us on what our product development looks like, what does the end product look like, and then working closely with our regulatory teams to understand, okay, well, what's the data, what would then be the ideal intended use and indication, and then what's the data that's required to get us across the line with the health authorities, and then have those insights inform our clinical development pathway, right? And so I think you're taking success criteria for what a physician would need to see data-wise for them to be confident that they could instill this in practice. You're taking success criteria from the regulatory team of what the health authority would need to see for your product to actually do what you say it's doing. And that's when you develop your clinical development pathway, and that all increases the success probability of success of having clinicians adopt it, and obviously health authorities approve it.
Yeah, and I think what you speak to, Aman, is exactly kind of my area of interest, is that regulatory strategy. And you speak about the importance of how that integration of that strategy into the development early on is so critical to ultimately get that access to the technology, to
Right.
ultimately actually you're driving the outcomes. It's not really, it's the technology itself, it's actually the outcomes that that technology is enabling and ensuring that it's actually used. So my recommendation often in these areas, especially where the regulations are still developing, is to treat it, I like to look at analogs. So like you have series funding, and investors and VCs need to get familiar with your technology, familiar with the disease state and the outcome that you're trying to drive. I like to also think about the regulatory strategy as being towards a series aspect, where you have milestones and you're kind of building that strategy, all anchored on the intended use and the user. But as you develop, that can adopt, but you need that kind of anchor to start. So seeding that with experts to build that regulatory strategy in, so it's the outside in, inside out, but also seeding that with regulatory authorities such that in the time point it makes sense, so that health authorities are also becoming familiar with the technology and helping to enable that strategy for access. So what are your thoughts, closing thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely agree. Bring regulatory in early. I think far too often we see regulatory come in late. Our superpower here is bringing regulatory in early. And I would suggest all companies look at that superpower.
Thank you, Aman. Really important area of neuroscience, and as we see, epidemics of diabetes and other aspects that can influence these conditions. So really important work there. And thank you so much for joining me today and talking about it.
Thank you, everybody.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Zina, for such a great interview. Thank you, Aman, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So just an incredibly impactful interview, and a lot of key learnings there, particularly given the fact that so much of what we're working with in digital health and human rights has a regulatory feature to it. Like anything else that we've seen globally over the last 100 years in public health, the need for medical technology to go through a regulatory process to ensure that it has not only safety, as we all know needs to be the #1 priority, but also efficacy. And so those regulatory pathways and those regulatory processes that Zina and Aman have just discussed are critical in understanding not only are we impacting folks in the entire 8 billion human population community around the world, but are we doing so in a safe and efficacious way, particularly the folks on the lower income 1 billion.